Welcome back to the podcast,
Attack for 20.
episode 9, Matchup Roulette.
Flesh and Blood is a matchup roulette.
This is a topic that I think a lot of people are thinking about, especially as we're coming up onto the Pro Tour, as well as I've heard some people talk about it in the context of Uprising Draft. But before we start, first, I want to remind everyone that we have a website, rate this podcast /A420 podcast. That's the letter A, the number 420 podcast. I'll include a link in the episode notes and the description. Basically, it's like quite an involved process, isn't it?
Yeah, it takes a few steps. You're on your desktop, you can only rate us on like iTunes and Podchaser, I think. It takes a couple of steps. You're gonna have to like log into your iTunes and do all this stuff, but and oh, you have to have watched or listened, sorry, to our podcast on whatever platform you're gonna rate us on. I think they do that so that bots can't do it. But yeah, it really helps us. And as we start getting more ratings, we currently have 0. We will pick our favorite ones and read them out and give you guys a shout out. So please, if you haven't done that, give it a try. It does take a couple of minutes, so we appreciate you guys doing that in advance.
Okay. Before we get started onto the main topic, last week in Flesh and Blood, we were both at the same armory, but in different draft pods.
Actually, I drafted, I think, an extra time. And both times I drafted Dromai, so it was actually pretty fun.
He broke the cycle.
Yeah. Well, both drafts I just pack one, pick one, the red Ember Maw, and then I got another red Ember Maw like some point in pack one, and I was just like, that's it for me. I'm a Dromai drafter now.
How much of it do you think is... Because I remember in the early days of Uprising Draft, you would still pick like the Ember Maw, red Ember Maw kind of early, but then just like leave Dromai because it just ended up not being open.
Yeah. So one of the drafts, basically on pick 4, there was a yellow Ember Maw, and it was missing a ninja card, and it still had 2 Dromai cards, and I did the math, and I was like, basically, it felt like Icelander cards were being taken, and so I just took the Ember Maw and called it a day, and then the next pack was missing ninja cards, and still had 2 Dromai cards. I was like, I'm a Dromai player. So I think it's just that for that pod, it was just 5 was a little bit overdrafted maybe. It was just like if one 5 card is missing and I'm kind of leaning towards Dromai, like and I had these powerful Dromai cards, I'm gonna play Dromai. It just is like the power of the cards in that first pack, because especially now that I understand how like the I always forget the name of it when we do the podcast.
Collation.
Yeah, well, the collation. I know that like there's probably gonna only be like one more yellow Ember Maw, right? Like
Yeah.
there's likely just gonna be 2. So if I don't take it right here, like I might never see another yellow Ember Maw again. And yellow Ember Maw is still quite powerful. Something that did happen that I thought was pretty interesting is I had a silent stilettos. I attacked with a red Ember Maw, thinking that was just gonna be my turn, and I was gonna arsenal a yellow Ember Maw, and I had one floating because I pitched the blue, but instead my opponent popped the red Ember Maw, so I triggered my silent stilettos and I attacked him with like 2 Ash Wings, and he was at 1.
Ooh, that's tough.
That's not a play that you do very often, but I thought it was pretty neat and I wanted to share.
Yeah, I drafted Icelander in our shared but not shared armory.
Oh yeah, the 7-person pod.
Yeah, I ended up being 3 Icelanders. I don't know. I thought that the deck that I drafted was okay, but it was just the person who won the pod just had a very strong Dromai deck and pretty on target for the episode. That matchup, especially if the Dromai is a strong deck, I feel like is very difficult to win for the Icelander.
Yes. I think that we did mention that during our winning with Icelander and winning with Dromai episodes 4 and 5, where we kind of just talk about how that can be a very lopsided matchup. What do you think? What cards in particular do you think? This was Trebbing, right? What cards in particular do you think made that matchup kind of hard? Like, What
I
was it?
think it's a combination of things. I think normally, uh, so like if you have a plethora of blue ice wizard like non-tech actions, you can kind of grind through some of the like the Ashwings or whatever dragons that they might like pose. But I think you have a hard time dealing damage to them, especially if they play like a little bit conservative and then just like try to maximize their arcane barrier. So cards like Rake the Embers is difficult for you to advance your game plan while you're just kind of stalling them out. And then they can just come in with some turns where they just go like 1 for 3, go again into like a 2 for 7 or 2 for 8, and those are also pretty difficult to advance your own game plan, especially since the kill turn is so what's it called? The kill turn, especially against Dromai, is very uh, difficult because they have access to cards like Sand Cover as well as more than one arcane barrier.
Like, did you feel like Trepping had a lot of blues plus rakes?
Oh, dude, I just got yeah. He had like rakes. He played like 2 rakes against me, and then I just got ranched by like he attacked with a Chromai, and then I killed it, and then he played a Vinzerakai, and then attacked with it, and I was like, oh crap, well I don't have the cards to block it and like deal with it. I don't know. It was just tough times. Last week in Flesh and Blood, we went over. What about next week in Flesh and Blood?
Ah, yes. Next week we're going to Singapore. I think I'm flying earlier than you. For the calling, of course. And hopefully not for the battle hardened, just the calling. But
For the chicken rice,
yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
for the infinity pools.
Yes, yes. And then we're gonna go directly from there to France. Gonna be a good time.
If you listen to us and you're gonna be in Singapore, come say hi.
Yeah, yeah. Tell us if it's helpful for you, and tell us if it's not.
Yeah, yeah.
Particularly if it's not helpful.
Yes. Well, if it's not helpful, why would they continue to listen to us?
I don't know. Maybe just those are like the most passionate people. Actually, they like hate your podcast and they just like still listen to it.
Yeah, true. Okay. On to the main topic, the matchup roulette. Michael, would you say like how much would you say matchups like affected the tournaments that you entered?
Are we talking about Flesh and Blood or?
First, let's start with like other card games like Magic the Gathering or any other card games that you've played.
Uh, I think that's also format dependent. Like, in standard, it felt like at least most of the standards we played, like there was just like these like mid range fests.
Mm-hmm.
Like every single deck just had all these like innate 2 for 1s.
Yeah.
There could be like an aggro deck, like a red-ish based aggro deck, but I don't know. Like it felt like by the way Magic did it, best out of 3, 15 card sideboard. Like you usually had a plan for everybody. There was somewhat of like the control decks typically beat the aggro decks beat or get beat by the mid range decks, and the mid range decks get beat by the control decks. Like that was like the
Mm-hmm.
overall thesis, but I know what we're talking about next. So I guess I want to say like it didn't feel as roulette-y.
I think for games that have like the best out of 3 format, although I think even in Flesh and Blood, if you play the best out of 3, I don't think much would change. But like those games were designed with a certain amount of variance built into the game, and so I always felt like even if you have a bad matchup, at least like you could play into the variance of the game.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. That's really the only TCG that I played enough to get an idea of how um, matchups worked, I guess.
I played a little Pokemon TCG for like while I was doing research during COVID times. And that game also like a lot of the matchups felt honestly like even-ish, at least like if you're playing good decks. Except I remember there's like this one deck that plays like this Pokemon that you just like doesn't take any damage from GX or like V Pokemon, and like I mean you can run into like pure counters, but usually those kinds of decks are more like fringe decks than in Flesh and Blood, where sometimes even like the quote unquote meta decks there can be like hard counters. And I think transitioning. So the main difference uh, that we're alluding to between Flesh and Blood and these other card games is the game engine, I guess if you call it that, for Flesh and Blood, just like leads to a lower variance game in general. A part of that is because you draw 4 cards every turn. Part of it is because you can basically stack your deck if the game goes on long enough.
Yep, yep. I think particularly that actually that you're able because uh I guess we didn't talk about this, but last weekend I also went to Gen Con and I uh demoed a few TCGs. One Piece TCG particularly is a little bit new, hasn't come out yet, but also My Hero Academia and White Shorts. And all of these games actually use the same system for their like discard pile, and basically the discard pile, like White Shorts calls it a waiting room. So it's not like an actual discard pile. You put it in there, and then when you're done filtering through your deck, you just shuffle your graveyard basically, and that becomes your deck again. And that's distinctly what Flesh and Blood does not do. So what Flesh and Blood does is when you pitch resources, you pitch them to the bottom of your deck, and that gives you a type of control to your deck that maybe I just am unaware, but I don't know any other TCGs that kind of do that, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah. I think it's twofold. I think the deck velocity and also like the being able to control like your draws later on. I think the closest thing that I can think of that I've played to Flesh and Blood in terms of like matchups is actually Hearthstone. Because when I played Hearthstone Constructed, so like I think a lot of people when they first asked me what Flesh and Blood was like, I think most people default to saying that it's kind of like Magic, but I actually think that Flesh and Blood, the card game that it's most similar to in terms of how it plays out, is Hearthstone that I've played. Just because in Hearthstone you play with like 30 card decks, right? And then there's like all these cards that like you cantrip and whatever, and so you go through like a good percentage of your deck. I would say like in most like constructed matches of Hearthstone, like if you're in like the grind like fatigue whatever matchups, you see like your entire deck, and sometimes it just like ends up being like whether or not you got enough value out of your cards to fatigue your opponent out, um, because they just like run out of cards. Or if in like the more aggro matches, even like in the aggro matches, I think you go through at least like I want to say like 65 to 70% of your deck. And for Flesh and Blood, you in Classic Constructed, you draw 4 cards every turn. So you have 15 hands essentially if you submit like a lean 60. So if your game goes for like I don't know like 10 turn cycles, you go through like 2/3 of your deck. And 10 turn cycles is actually quite long depending on the matchup, but in some matchups where it gets dragged out, it's pretty average, or games actually go longer than that.
Yeah, yeah, agree. I think the other part of Flesh and Blood that hasn't been mentioned yet, at least, is how flexible cards are. So each card can be played and can be used to block and can be used to pitch. Obviously, there are exceptions, but in general, most cards can do all three. And in all these other TCGs that we like reference, those are often three distinct type of cards.
Yeah, yeah. And in general, just lowering the total variance, right?
Exactly. Like you're still able to do things no matter what 4 cards you draw, most of the time, of course.
And so I think because there is less variance in Flesh and Blood, it's pretty funny. I think the example that I can think of that's most salient. So like you know how like in Magic, people say, "Oh man, like I lost because this guy drew like this card into that card into this card," and just like whatever, aggroed me out. And if he didn't draw like these like 3 cards, then I would have been done for. When I was playing Briar, when Starvo was like the main deck of choice, I remember I play like my channel Mount Heroic, and I was like, well, if he doesn't draw the Crippling Crush or the Spinal Crush or the Channel Lake Frigid, or it's just like like a list of like all these cards, and he gets like 4 draws plus like he could have arsenaled it, so it could have been like 4 from like the previous turn
Yeah,
plus
Oak
Crown
Old.
of Seeds. Yeah, Oaken Old. Yeah, he just needs to not have like one out of these like 12 cards, and so like the reason why I'm giving this example is just like um usually if you have like a unfavorable matchup, there's like something inherent to either like the card pool or the hero ability or like whatever it is, like it's like a aggregation of all these factors that cause you to be losing, right? And so I think that in order to I think it's good to have like the framework to understand, well, rather than even on like a one hero to one hero, I personally like to think of it more as like strengths and weaknesses of certain heroes. So heroes will have weaknesses to certain types of strategies, and then if you have this kind of framework, then you can kind of begin to decide whether or not it's worth it to dedicate cards to adjust your deck to play into those weaknesses of the other decks that you're trying to improve your matchups for. So I'll give an example. Same format, Viserai versus Starvo. I think when we were testing at the very beginning, do you remember? I think we were in the we went to the Airbnb and we were testing like Viserai and the Starvo.
Yeah, this was right before Battle Hardened Pitts. No, Philly. Battle Hardened Philly. The first Battle Hardened.
I was like, you play Viserai, and then we were like playing the games, and it's like, oh, it's not even close. Starvo just like runs him over.
Yeah, full context is we had just kind of heard of the Starvo deck, and both Yanji and I actually brought Viserai to the Battle Hardened. And then we were like, oh, let's test some games. Like it seems like it's a good deck. What should we do? And initially, I think Yanji, I was playing Starvo. Who was playing Starvo?
I think I was playing Starvo, and you were playing Viserai.
Oh yeah, I was because yeah. And you were just like destroying me, and I was just like, how do you? So then, since you're the better Viserai player, we were like, let's swap. You play Viserai and I play Starvo, and then it was like the same result. And then we were just like, oh my god, we just started looking for the Tales of Arya comments for the other deck.
Yeah, definitely at the very beginning of the format, it felt like very difficult to play into that.
Yeah, I mean, you were also leading me. You were like, you have to play the Runeblood barrier. It's the only way you have a chance.
That card's so bad, dude. Yeah, I was leading you astray. Um, so I think going back to the framework that we were talking about, you have to like kind of consider, okay, like, well, what are Starvo's like strengths and weaknesses? So his strength obviously is that he has these like Mondo disruptive hands, right? And then also he has like a pretty strong equipment suite, just on the virtue of being an elemental guardian. But his weakness is that he plays like a lot of cards that block poorly or don't block at all. And also he sometimes has turns where he just does like literally nothing.
Yeah. Like his overall damage output is actually not that insane.
Yeah.
Like like his like one of his some of his best turns are 13 damage turns. Like when it's just like in terms of just pure damage.
Yeah.
Now that's usually like an Ogun Old fused and with the Yahtzee activated or the triggered ability, so it's 9 plus potentially, two extra cards. But when you're just talking about damage, it's not actually like nuts.
Yeah, his damage output wasn't high numerically, but I think it was the combination of at the time Awakening, but then also later on, even when Awakening is banned, having access to 3 Oaken Olds plus 3 Crippling Crushes made it so that there was like 6 turns where you would just go so far above like the normal rate that would be difficult for like any decks to come back from, right? In and so it's like knowing all of this, knowing that Starbo basically has 6 like Mondo turns, you can kind of begin to construct your game plan around that. So I think to continue the anecdote, we had a really hard time with Viserai into Starvo initially at that tournament, but I kept on working on the deck and found that basically if you try to like aggro out the Starvo, if you play like an aggro game plan, it's like very difficult to fit in defense reactions because you just like introduce a lot of inconsistencies. But if you're just going like this full like OTK plan where most of the time you're just like whatever, you just want to play like a read the runes or 2 card hands like Mordred Tide plus read the runes, playing like a bunch of defense reactions is actually not too bad. And so it ended up being like, I think for Viserai into Starvo, there was maybe like I think it was like 11 or 13 cards or whatever it was that you would like completely transform your deck from being like a aggro oriented like mid-range deck into just like a full like blocking like OTK deck. And I think by the end of the format, before they banned Bloodsheath Scaletta in CC, I think my win rate against Starvo was somewhere between like 65 to like 75%.
I mean, this is like also we would be remiss to not mention just how powerful Scalita was in that deck. That
Oh
was
yeah.
one of the reasons why you could just sit around dirtling. Like actually making rune chants in the OTK strategy was massively inefficient. Like after the first turn of making rune chants, every turn you were making like one, two, or three. Like it was just such a slow process.
Yeah, you needed to make like 24 or whatever rune chants.
Yeah, yeah. In order to kind of guarantee the kill, like sometimes maybe you're forced to go a little earlier, but like that, I mean, it was just like the Clash of Titans. Like both decks had some very powerful things, and that was kind of taking advantage of Viserai being a flexible hero. So Viserai could be aggressive. In fact, another matchup that Viserai was actually fine into was the Prism matchup, where you would not want to be just sitting around making rune chants. You'd be a lot more aggressive and pop that Scalita for just maybe two rune chants of value.
Yeah, and so the in this case, like you have enough sideboard slots in your deck, or sorry, rather, if you devote enough sideboard slots into your deck, your hero's toolkit, like most notably the Bloodsheath Scaletta, being in your toolkit kind of enables you to overcome like the deficiencies in like your primary strategy, right? For a counter example, Oldhim into Prism is probably like universally accepted as being just like a terrible matchup. And I've seen lists floating around. Kale McCreath actually tweeted at me. And it's like, oh, if you just include these like 13 cards, whatever, then you can make the Prism matchup like okay. And I think the general consensus, I've seen stuff like you run like Lead the Charge and like Wounding Blow and stuff. It's just like things that just like generally do not like really fit with like the normal Oldhim game plan. Uh, I think that all of these cards don't really address Prism's natural weakness, where in my opinion, Prism's weakness is that she has a really hard time once she's on the back foot to be able to string together a pivot turn because one, she doesn't have armor, like real armor to block on like the pivot turn. And then two, most of her power cards require like I would say like three cards to play. Like you need like if you want to play like a yellow aura, for example, you need like three cards, like one like a blue and a tunic counter or something. And you need to like be doing something else in addition to playing that aura. Like you need another blue aura.
And that aura doesn't block. Like it doesn't even block two. It blocks. It just can't block.
Yeah, yeah. So in general, if we break this down, then what is Prism's actual weakness? In my opinion, Prism's actual weakness is to decks that can go much higher than 12 damage per like 4 or 5 card hand. Decks in the past that she struggled with is like the original version of Cheerios Briar. I think she struggled against Chain. I think now she struggles against Fi. Just like decks that can threaten a lot of damage per turn kind of consistently to just like prevent the pivot turn from ever happening.
Yeah, or just punish you for a lot of damage if you're trying to play an aura.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think that if you look at all the cards that you can play, like most people when they're like approaching like Oldhim into Prism, they're just looking at it from the angle of like, oh, I got to deal with these auras. But the issue is that you're not really taking advantage of the weaknesses that Prism has, and you're just trying to kind of manage her against her strengths. And so like no matter like how many like cards you devote to the sideboard, it's never really going to be a good matchup. And I am pretty sure even if you devote like 13 whatever cards into the Prism matchup, it's still going to be difficult to beat like good Prism players. I think I've seen floating around on the discussion forums where basically like the whole point is you just like you play all these cards so that you can beat the bad Prism players that you play early on in Swiss.
And I guess to add to that, what you're trying to say here, I think, is effectively sometimes having sideboard cards can really make or break certain matchups. Sometimes though, it might not be worth the effort, because having these sideboard slots, like having 13 slots dedicated to Prism, it's a real cost. Most deck lists are relatively tight. You have 60 cards that are, you have to present at least 60. You have anywhere from 5 equipment to maybe like 6 or 7. And so there's only about 13 cards typically. And even 13 is quite generous because some decks or some heroes need more than like 7 equipment. If you dedicate all of them to Prism, you're not dedicating any to any other matchup. And that could be a real detriment. Like you could lose the Prism matchup anyway, even with these 13 cards, and also be disadvantaged or not favored in the mirror against some of the aggro decks, maybe against some of the wizards as Oldhim.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think uh really I think you need to ask yourself when you're dedicating like these sideboard spots. There's I think in my opinion there's like two ways that you can gain percentage points in Flesh and Blood. One, you could just have an ultimate. It's just kind of like in other games, like going bigger. Like you could add cards to your deck that just cause it to have an end game advantage. Where if you go through like all of the cards in your deck and you and your opponent are playing optimally, you just like beat them out. And this is kind of, I think, like the kind of advantage that Prism has over Oldhim, where if the game kind of like drags on, like Oldhim just cannot answer effectively all of Prism's threats. The other kind of advantage that you can generate is you can put cards into your deck that will shorten the game and induce variance. So maybe an example of this is, in my opinion, like when Briar is playing against Oldhim, right? Uh, I think nowadays Briar, I think after they printed cards like Revel and Runeblood, and Swarming Gloomveil, Briar might have like a little bit more even time going into Oldhim, but definitely during I think Tales of Aria meta, like the way that the Briar deck was just like configured, I think was not that strong ultimately endgame against Oldhim because it was like super linear, but you had the option to kind of induce variance by playing cards like Channel Mount Heroic, where it's not like a very consistent strategy. But if you set it up and you draw like a good hand, you can just like high roll like your opponent like crazy. Or similarly, I think Briar into Starvo is kind of the same way, right? And I think in Flesh and Blood in general, most of the time to induce variance means to just like have some kind of like crazy super high damage cap play. Fi can do it with cards like Toma Firebrand. I think is a card that increases your damage cap significantly. What are other good
Sonata.
examples? Yeah, Sonata Arcanix, in Viserai, you pay 1, you draw 2 cards. That's like a huge bump in damage. For
Art
as
of
opposed
War.
to like yeah, as opposed to the current rate, yeah, Art of War. Just like these kinds of cards that are a little bit higher variance, but can lead to these extremely high damage turn scenarios, I think will always give your deck like a chance, even if you're losing in the end game scenario.
Yeah. I think it's kind of funny. So when we say Flesh and Blood is a matchup roulette game, like it's not like other TCGs aren't matchup roulette, but like if you are in a bad matchup, it's it's like you can't win because your opponent got mana screwed or like flooded. Like there's a like we say less variance because the way the decks sit and the way the hands work. Because I don't know, I just think of like I was playing mono red burn and I was against a blue white control, and that's typically one of the worst matchups. This is like Theros standard in Magic the Gathering. My opponent couldn't draw a fourth land, and I just won.
I think this is like most prominent in Flesh and Blood when you get into like 50-50s
Sure.
or matchups that are close to 50-50. I think those are the ones that most closely resemble the scenario that you're describing. So like the reason why it's kind of interesting, like Flesh and Blood is kind of like I want to say it's like chess. It's not exactly like chess, but If you go through like your whole deck and you're like pitch stacking whatever, it's kind of like chess where you're setting up like an end game position, and you just set up like you're gonna draw like these hands at the end of the game, and so you're kind of like checkmating your opponent in a sense. In order to have like a true 50-50 in Flesh and Blood, basically you and your opponent have to be trying to shorten the game so that the only thing that matters is when you draw like half of your deck, because you only go through maybe like 6 turn cycles, or even less. Like a lot of the matches in the Stubby Hammers, Phi, whatever meta, maybe they'll only go like 2 turn cycles or 3 turn cycles. So when you're only drawing like 20%, 30%, whatever of your deck, you just introduce a lot more variance into the game. And then so the matchups will feel a lot more coin flippy. And I think that's kind of how you can get an edge. And this also should inform how you are kind of playing, or like your strategy for playing in these matchups as well, right? You just like need to take more risks.
So like a good example. Okay, I'll try to use more modern examples. So like a good example is like if you're Viserai, you're against Bravo Showstopper, and they have not played a Crippling Crush, and you're on like turn 7, and you're like you are playing in a way like, should I push a little bit more damage this turn or should I not? And they don't block your first attack. There should be alarm bells going on. Like you're about to get Crippling Crushed.
Right.
And alternatively, on the flip side of that, if you're Bravo playing to Viserai, you should know that if you can't shorten this game, every time they do like a Mordred Revel, like those are kind of like the two, like one play together, like they're just cheating the game in terms of like damage. Like every time that happens, you just take damage. Like it's like it's just gonna happen. They have 3 Mordred Tides, they have 3 Revels in their deck. Like like every time they draw them, you're just gonna take damage, and unless you can put them in a situation where they're forced to block with them, you're gonna have to take damage. So, I think just like any type of matchup where both players can kind of, where both heroes are able to kind of block, you just have to keep in mind the strengths and weaknesses of your opponent's deck, and just accept, like don't feel bad, like, oh my gosh, he's doing it again, the Mordred and the, like, they're in his deck, he's gonna draw them. If you keep letting the game go on, like, well, don't be surprised if it happens, right?
Like if that is like a play that you do not want to have happen, maybe you should just like be trading life instead of like letting that, because it's gonna, like, that play is gonna happen eventually.
I think that kind of touches on what we said last week in terms of who's a beatdown, but really what I'm trying to say is there's less variance in the sense that if you're able to block, you will decrease the variance. And that could be favorable or not favorable for you. So, and I think what also is cool about that is it touches upon why I think I think that we'll probably, this is kind of like projection mode, but I don't think we'll see as much Phi going into Singapore and Utrecht. Sorry, Lille, because Phi does not have that type of flexibility. Like he cannot prolong the game if he so chooses to. It's just very hard. It's almost impossible.
Yeah, it's kind of one-dimensional. If I honestly reminds me a lot of kind of Cheerios Briar, in that the deck just like wants to play like a certain way.
It doesn't actually. So I knew you would probably bring that up. Cheerios Briar was busted on another dimension. That's like you could play Cheerios Briar in a way that you would get like 3 or 4 embodiments,
Oh yeah, sure.
and then you would just block with 1 non-attack for like 5 or 6, and it was just like you could block a Command and Conquer with 1 card.
Yeah, Cheerios Briar numerically was probably stronger than Phi, but I just mean in terms of being able to like alter your game plan. Like you can't, like, I don't think Cheerios Briar can really like prolong the game.
Sure, sure. Actually, like it to me, Phi is just like the other Ninja Katsu. We very briefly flirted with testing aggro Katsu like a long time ago. Even then, we were playing Belittle, and Art of War, and it was just, we tested into Chain, and that was just not a good time. So like, I do think that like matchup roulette is a thing. Phi has good matchups, but the matchups where you might want to block a little bit more, it's just very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah, one last, I guess, topic that I wanted to go over before, and we might dedicate like a larger episode to this, probably either at the Pro Tour or maybe after the Pro Tour, is kind of when you're preparing for these like larger tournaments, knowing that this kind of matchup roulette exists, and that there's only like so many things that you can do to mitigate the matchups. How should you approach like selecting a deck then for these larger tournaments? Like you made a prediction where you thought that since Fi cannot like really, I guess, like toe the line, if somebody finds, for example, like a way to exploit Fi, it's like very difficult for Fi to like beat them, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think that you have to, this is kind of like where I guess like preparation and also just kind of like being active within the community, trying to get like a pulse, getting the pulse on like what everybody is doing is going to be like most beneficial to you. I think I've seen somebody talk about this on another YouTube video. I don't exactly remember, but you kind of have to like make yourself like a table of like all the decks that you think are going to be at the tournament, and then you have to make a judgment call as to like how many of them there are going to be, right? I can say from my experience that day 1 and day 2 percentages are usually fairly different. Like day 2 decks are usually going to be like the ones that are actually good. And day 1, like no matter like how powerful you think like a deck is, it's very difficult for that deck to occupy more than like 25% of the meta for the initial tournament. And so you just have to like kind of make like your best guess of like what you think everybody's going to play, what you think like the best performing decks are, and just like make yourself like a weighted average. Like, is it worth it for me to put these cards into my deck to improve this matchup by like this percentage? If I'm going to expect to see it like this percentage of the time, like how much is it going to affect my overall like total win rate, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of the reason what inspired us to talk about FAB as a matchup roulette is that currently in the constructed meta and to an extent Uprising draft, people are saying that the meta is relatively healthy. And I think a lot of that is because there is no one single like overarching deck that just like beats everybody.
Yeah, every deck has key weaknesses to decks that are realistically playable.
Yep. And they're not all the same.
Do you think that there are like takeaways? So like if you're listening to this podcast and now that let's say you accept that there is a matchup roulette, do you think there's something that the listeners can do in order to like better prepare themselves?
I think dimensionally, something we didn't talk about is also Blitz, but I think dimensionally, it's the best way to apply this to your future tournaments, without really knowing what people are going to play, is to actually play a couple of these matchups and get a feel for how weighted towards one hero or the other it is. Don't just take someone else's word for it. Like, someone can tell you that this hero is either good or bad into Icelander. Try to, like, play a couple of games and, like, know why. Like, it definitely will help you. And you might find that there are some cards that you can sideboard and make or break, or that's just another matchup that you're going to sign the slip and go get KFC with this guy. So, like, I think that's something that I would highly recommend. And you don't have to play that many games. Like 2 or 3 games is, in my opinion, all it takes. If you can kind of just like, as you're playing, get a feel for what's going on, and neither player kind of just drew like an actual useless hand that's like a low chance of happening.
I think that's actually one of the nice things about Flesh and Blood. Like you don't actually have to play the matchup that many times.
Yeah.
To really understand.
Yeah.
Who's winning or losing.
Yeah. I think the other thing is you should know your deck pretty well that you end up choosing, because we talk about FAB as a matchup roulette to make it seem like you want to pick like the right deck, but if you don't know how to play Ultim very well, and you have not even devoted the 2 or 3 games to kind of like most of these matchups, you might lose to I think Viserai is considered kind of Ultim. Like Ultim kind of beats Viserai, and in theory it makes sense, right? Because Prana Seeds, Ultim can either use Rampart or Stalagmite, but whatever, the way Viserai's damage is kind of split, Ultim usually gets an advantage in the sense that he can block it very efficiently. Also, Ultim's Ice React is very good against Viserai, who often, like, the max damage hands are the 4 or 5 card hands. But if you have never played that matchup, you might just lose. Like, you might not be playing it correctly. I think most of the time you can just blindly block, and like always decide between hammer versus like ice react versus like blocking 3. Like I think maybe if you're always just blocking, you can win, but like, those are like some things you got to figure out for yourself,
Yeah, it's like sometimes the edges that you have can be kind of thin. Like that doesn't mean that you won't win a large percentage of the time. you can win. Put it this way, like you can win like 90% of your matches, where your edge is just that you just get ahead by like one or two cards, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't know how to play your deck optimally and you give away like one or two cards worth of value, you just gave away your edge. And if you give away more than one or two cards of value, then that's really how you lose the game.
What are some ways you can give up? I know we're going a little bit longer, but
Oh yeah. I mean, so like in your example, like Ultim versus like Viz, right? Let's say like if you don't know that you're supposed to ice react in order to deny Arsenal, then you can give the Viserai access to like a 4 or 5 card hand when they should not have. And them being able to like set up an arsenal and like start like a cycle of having an arsenal every turn for multiple turns basically unlocks maybe an extra like 3 or 4 damage for them every hand, as opposed to if they had like an off-ish turn and you could like block them all out. That was like your chance to kind of get ahead.
yeah, yeah. And I guess to just literally talk about that example a little bit more, that's an understanding of Viserai's weaknesses. And Viserai's weaknesses, and it's a very Runeblade weakness, is he needs like a non-attack and an attack. And ideally that non-attack is a Maverin Skies or like an extender we like to call, like a go again giver. To really have like a semblance of a good hand. Like there are creative ways to formulate other hands, like with a Rattlebones and a Gloom Veil, or you have a bunch of rune chants and you have a rune flat. Like there are other ways to do it, but as a whole, like he does need to draw like a good split of cards. And by having an arsenal where you arsenal one or the other, it increases the chances of him having just like a relevant hand by like so much. It's an extra card.
Yeah, it's most specifically, it's also like a card that you're carrying over, knowing that let's say you drew a hand that's like non-attack biased. So you arsenal a non-attack, you're probably gonna draw like a hand that's like more attack biased in the future. It just like smooths out your draws by denying that to your opponent. You're actually doing a lot more than just like taking the card away.
You're just increasing the chances that they might not be able to have as much of a relevant hand. And that's just something that like you play a few games and you get a feel. Another way of kind of preparing for these tournaments is honestly seeking out the people that you think are a little bit better at those heroes and just having them beat you with those heroes. I think I learn 90%. I think 90% of what makes me a better Flesh and Blood player is when I lose games and I kind of figure out how I lost or what my opponent's plan was while they were playing. Like if they stumble into a victory, like I got unlucky, they got lucky. Like that's a different, like that's just a feels bad, whatever. But I really actually appreciate when I'm like, you know, pounded to pieces and just completely destroyed. Like the harder you beat me, the more I'm like, dang, okay. Like either my deck construction, like I've learned something here, right?
Hopefully you guys found this conversation to be helpful. Again, remember to rate, to give our podcast reviews on the various platforms. I think probably you're gonna have to like download some app like podcasting apps on your mobile phone if you haven't already. I don't know. It helps us a lot, and we will read out the most interesting, or maybe the only reviews that we get.
If you don't want to do any of that, leaving a comment on YouTube is helpful as well. I have been reading some of the comments. I particularly know that there's some interest in just more examples, especially maybe more examples that pertain to the current format. And so I've kept that in mind. You are not unheard.
Yeah, we're also trying something new to improve the audio quality. So we definitely listen to any and all feedback.
All right. Well, I guess that's this week. We'll see you next week, and thanks so much for listening.
See you on the next one.